Thank you, Francois, and thank you for organizing such a wonderful meeting, one of the best, most interesting meetings I've been at. And thank you all for coming back from lunch outside. Now for something completely different. Do you ever think about why you are the way you are? Your personality, your mental health and illness, your cognitive abilities and disabilities? Well, what I would like to do is, to convince you that DNA, inherited DNA differences, are a bigger part of the story than you might have thought. I'll be describing what we call the nature-nurture issue, genetics and environmental influences. And it's a story that's sort of the story of my career in the last 45 years, showing that genetics is very important in our individuality. And then I'll also talk about the DNA revolution, where we're beginning to identify specific DNA differences that account for the differences in our behavior. And that's why I think, for some of you at least, DNA will be an unexpected source of inspiration. I'm going to give you an overview of my book that came out a few months ago, and the paperback just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's available in the bookshop. And it's called How DNA Makes Us Who We Are. And it's the culmination of my 45 years of research trying to understand genetic and environmental influences in behavior. When I was in graduate school 45 years ago, it was dangerous to even talk about genetic influence. Environmentalism, the view that we are what we learn, so dominated psychology that you couldn't even talk about genetics. You could read in textbooks at the time that schizophrenia was caused by what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. I know that's hard to believe, but it's really true. And in the subsequent 40 years, most scientists have been convinced by a mountain of evidence that genetics, inherited DNA differences, account for the majority of our individuality. So I knew that scientists have changed their perception to a more balanced view of nature and nurture. And there's signs that the zeitgeist is more accepting of it. I don't know how much you think genetics is important in who you are, but I was still worried when the book came out in October how it would be received. Some friends of mine told me it was like a professional suicide note because the subtitle says How DNA Makes Us Who We Are, which is a spoiler. I'm mostly talking about the influence of genetics. But the reception was very positive on the left there in the print media, on television sorts of interviews. I especially recommend Hard Talk. And in lots of public events like this, as well as in social media, people seem to be quite accepting of the general influence of genetics. And so the book has two parts. The first part is about genetics. Research has been going on over a century trying to disentangle nature and nurture. So I'll talk about that a bit, but mostly about the implications of finding out how important genetics is. The second part of the book is what I call genomics, the DNA revolution, where we're now identifying specific bits of DNA that predict behavior. So just to begin, if you ask most people how heritable you think things are, eye color, for example, most people would agree with the research saying it's almost entirely genetic, that is due to inherited DNA differences. Do you think so? Blue eyes, brown eyes. So when you get to things like weight, more complex traits, what do you think? How heritable do you think weight is? Of the differences in this room, to what extent are they due to inherited DNA differences, despite the fact that some of us are on diets and exercise a lot and others don't? Well, the answer is about twice as much as people think. About 70% of the differences between people in the populations we studied are due to inherited DNA differences. And then when you get to behaviors like cognitive abilities or mental health and illness or school achievement, people again underestimate genetic influence by about 50%. It's about 70% heritable. So people get the idea. We're talking about why people differ and the extent to which genetic differences make them different. But when you scratch the surface a little bit, it's clear there's a lot of misunderstandings about this concept of heritability, which is a statistic that describes individual differences in a population and asks the extent to which inherited DNA differences account for the differences we observe in a particular population at a particular time. So if you look at our 3 billion base pairs of DNA, 99% of them are identical for all of us. And that's what makes us human. We're looking at the 1% of DNA that differs between us. And that's what makes our individuality. So we're asking the extent to which the 1% of DNA that differs between us accounts for some of the differences we see in behavior. There's important caveats. We're describing what is in a particular population. We're not talking about what could be. So we study a population like this, and we ask the extent to which your inherited DNA differences account for the differences we observe in, say, weight or your cognitive abilities. It's not saying what could be at some other time, in some other culture, in some other universe. We're also describing the normal range of variation. You can only generalize from the samples you study, and we don't study samples of parents who are severely abusing their kids, nor do we study rare single-gene mutations. And then another misunderstanding is people think genetic equals innate or immutable. But it's very important to recognize that's not true. We're talking about probabilistic propensities rather than predetermined programming. It's not hardwired, it's not innate, it's not immutable. We're saying of the differences in a population, to what extent are the differences in that population due to inherited DNA differences? One method to get at that, I'll just mention these quickly, is a twin method, which has been around for about 100 years. About 1% of all births are twins, and 1/3 of them are identical twins. And identical twins come from the same fertilized egg that splits in the first few days of life. So they're clones of one another. They have the same DNA. The 2/3 of twins are non-identical. They could be opposite sex. Like any brother and sister, they're two separately fertilized eggs at the same time in the womb. So it's like a perfect natural experiment in that if a trait, say like programming ability, is, and we don't have any studies of this, if it's influenced by genetics, you'd have to predict that the identical twins are going to be more similar than the non-identical twins because they're twice as similar genetically. When I came to England in 1994, I began one of the largest twin studies from birth records in the UK of all the twins born in 94, 95, and 96. And so we started with about 15,000 pairs of twins, and we've just finished testing about 10,000 pairs at age 21. We studied lots of things that hadn't been studied much before, like early behavioral problems, language development, cognitive development. But when the kids got to school, I was interested in the business end of cognitive abilities, and that is educational achievement. So this slide summarizes 15 years of research where we looked at tested educational achievement of children using the twin method to compare identical and non-identical twins to estimate heritability, which is the extent to which genetic differences make a difference. And what was surprising is even in the first years of school, over half of the differences between kids in their tested educational achievement could be ascribed to inherited DNA differences. Now, this is a surprise for people in education, but geneticists haven't been surprised by that because what we've learned is that everything is substantially heritable. That is, physical traits like weight are about 70% heritable. Physiological traits like blood pressure are about 60% heritable. Psychological, behavioral traits are about 50% on average. 60% maybe for cognitive things, 40% maybe for personality things, but they're very substantially heritable, but not 100%. So these provide the best evidence we have for the importance of the environment. But the other part of the story is the environment works very differently from the way we thought it worked. It's changed so much from the environmentalism when I was in graduate school that the challenge now is to find any trait that is any measure of individual differences that is reliably measured that does not show significant genetic influence. Everything shows genetic influence. But maybe it's just the twin method. Well, another method that's been around for a long time is the adoption method, where parents and children, for example, normally share genes and environment. So if they're similar, that could be due to nature or nurture. The adoption design is like a social experiment in which you get parents who are environmentally related, nurture, that is, adoptive parents of adopted children, and then you have genetically related parents and offspring, biological parents who relinquish their children for adoption at birth and share nature, but not nurture. I did that in the book. In addition to the twins study, I talk about this adoption study that has been going on for 40 years at the Colorado Adoption Project. And like other studies, this is 20 years of research, we're looking at general cognitive ability, learning ability, AKA intelligence. And you find, like other studies have, that parents and offspring who are genetically related increase in similarity up to, say, 0.25 correlations by adolescence. So lots of people have found that. But everyone assumed that's nurture because the parents provide the environment for the children. So if it's nurture, you'd have to predict that adoptive parents would be just as similar to their adopted children. But instead, you find there's no resemblance between adoptive parents and their children. So what's it caused by? Well, it would have to be nature, genetics. If that's so, those adopted children ought to resemble their birth parents, even though they didn't see their birth parents after the 3rd day of life in the hospital. And that's exactly what you find. So these are powerful data showing the importance of nature over nurture, but they also show that the environment's important. But the environment isn't the environment that environmentalists from Freud onwards thought was important. That is, nurture, by which we imply systematic effects of family environments. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. So the first couple of chapters of the book talks about what I just described. And then the next 5 chapters are about some of the biggest findings in the behavioral sciences that have come from embedding our research in genetically sensitive designs. And 2 of them involve the environment. Because we've assumed everything's environmental, we haven't controlled in our studies for possible genetics. And so this was in the early 80s. This was a finding that shocked people. If you look at the hundreds of environmental measures that are used in the social and behavioral sciences, like parenting measures, life events measures, social support measures, they all show significant genetic influence in twin and adoption studies. Not 50%, but 25%. Now, you must admit that sounds weird. These are environmental measures. The environment doesn't have DNA, so how can this be? Well, the answer is, we think we call it the environment, but we're not measuring the environment out there independent of us. What we measure, say on life events, are things like having financial problems, having conflicts with people, this divorce. This isn't the environment out there. This is us interacting with our environment. And that's where the genetics comes in. So the reason this is important, and we call it the nature of nurture, is because what looks like systematic effects of the environment are often mediated genetically. So for example, you all know correlations don't imply causation. But invariably, if you read in the newspaper about, say, parents who read a lot to their kids have kids who read better at school, correlation. But you assume it's causal. Parents who read to the kids make their kids be better readers. Think about genetics, though. They share 50% of their genes. Maybe parents who like to read a lot have kids who like to read a lot. But the other possibility is what we call gene-environment correlation. As a grandparent, I really know this to be the case myself, is that we're responding to genetic differences in our children. If children ask you to read to them. If you have a grandson like I do who only wants to rough and tumble play, it's almost abusive if I say, sit there. You know, this is what a grandchild's supposed to do. I'm going to read to you. So I think we're responding to our children's genetic differences to a greater extent than people think. So that's one of those topics. But the other topic is that tells us about the environment. And this is harder to get your head around, especially after all these talks today. But it's the question, why are children in the same family so different? because they are. There's resemblance, but there's a lot of differences, as those of you who have more than one child know. And the reason this is a problem for the environment is because from Freud onwards, environmentalists assume that the family was the monolithic unit by which environments are doled out. So by, two kids in the same family have the same environment, so they ought to be similar. But they're not, they're very different. Genetics has no problem because kids in a family are 50% similar genetically, but they're 50% different genetically as well. Now, we said the environment's important, but what I've implied so far is that family resemblance, like the resemblance you saw between parents and offspring for cognitive ability, is explained genetically. So the environment's important, but it's not making kids in the same family similar, it's making them different. And what on earth could that be? It's not the sorts of systematic effects we used to study. It could be accidents, illnesses, but after 30 years of research, the answer is we don't know. It seems to be stochastic, in a word, random sorts of effects. Now, they're real, they affect you, but they're not the sort of thing we can get our hands on. It's like Bill Clinton, who said he went into politics because at the age of 16, he shook JFK's hand. And that just said, wow, that's what I want to be. Whether it's true or not, as you look back on your history, why are you here today? You probably all have stories like that, kind of capricious things that nudged you in one direction or another. And that's what we think the environment's about. So if you put these three things together that I've been talking about, the importance of genetics, the idea that environmental effects are important, but they're random in terms of trying to get a grasp on them, which is very important for parents to realize. And thirdly, that what looks like systematic effects of the environment are often mediated genetically, the nature of nurture. So this is how we get to the title of the book. What it means is that DNA, inherited DNA differences, are the major systematic force making us who we are, and the emphasis is on systematic. The environment's important, but we as parents, teachers, employers don't have as much control over that environment as we think we do. And so what I mean is that if you were cloned, and your clone would, of course, be raised in a different woman, prenatally, in a different family, go to a different school, have different friends, have a different job, that clone would be very similar to who you are in personality, abilities, and mental health. And that's because that clone is your identical twin. You would be as similar as identical twins reared together, because being reared together doesn't make you similar. Identical twins reared apart are just as similar as identical twins reared together. So this isn't a thought experiment. How many people know who this is? No? Yeah, some people did. You'll know by the end. This is Bobby, who grew up in Brooklyn. And he went to university in upstate New York, and everyone was calling him Eddie, and he thought this was some sort of weird psychology experiment. But instead, it was the next day he met Eddie, and they quickly worked out that they were both adopted. They were both adopted from the same adoption agency. But neither knew of the other's existence, and that created a lot of press. And then the press led to the discovery of this very rare event of identical triplets. So sometimes the fertilized egg doesn't just divide in two, one of them divides again, and they're identical triplets. And these guys are just so similar, not just in looks, you can't tell them apart, but also in personality. They're all outgoing. In psychopathology, they're all depressive. They all were treated for depression in adolescence, which is quite unusual. And they were all just moderately good students, but very bright and extremely well-read. They just didn't like school. But this is true of all three of them. They actually all quit university and set up a nightclub cum restaurant together. And this is documented in an award-winning film called Three Identical Strangers, which is going to be streamed, I think, this month sometime. So it's a dramatic illustration of the importance of nature over nurture. One of them was reared in an upper-class environment, one in a middle-class, and one in a lower-class environment. And yet they are amazingly similar. But it is only an anecdote. However, it's backed up by systematic national studies of identical twins reared apart, twin studies comparing identical and non-identical twins, and other sorts of adoption studies. So that's the mountain of evidence I was referring to that led to the conclusion that's what the subtitle of the book is about. The second part of the book, though, I would have been happy in my career if we had stopped there, because that really had a huge impact on psychology especially. But then came the DNA revolution, and the book talks about basic DNA. I think it's really important that we all have literacy about DNA, and how we tried to find genes unsuccessfully for about 10 years. And then in the last 10 years, it's been very successful, and especially in the last 3 years. And it has huge implications. This is where genetics is going to hit society, and it's already transforming science. So I thought it would be useful to know a little bit about the main ingredients of the DNA revolution. First is DNA, but do you know that you begin life as a single cell with a set of DNA, and that DNA is the same DNA in the trillions of cells of your body? What that means is MI5 or CIA can find out your DNA if they just have one cell, and that can come from a hair follicle, blood, urine, or, most often, saliva. So that's a kit that 23andMe uses. How many people here have done direct-to-consumer testing? For a techie group, that isn't very many. I'm surprised. But you know, you spit in a tube and saliva doesn't have DNA, but saliva collects some of the sloughed off cells inside your mouth, and all you need is one cell, any cell, and it will have all your DNA, and you can amplify that. And when you do, you can then genotype it. So we have only 99% of our DNA bases are the same. So what we're looking at is a type of DNA variant called single nucleotide polymorphism, which means difference. A nucleotide is one of the 4-letter alphabet of the DNA code, A, C, T's, and G's. And they're in a sequence, and that sequence determines genetic coding. So you can see these are 2 chromosomes. A chromosome is the double helix of DNA, maybe one from your mother, one from your father, 2 chromosomes. And all those bases are the same for the 2 chromosomes, except that one. And there's maybe originally all humans had a C, someone got a mutation that's a T, it spread through the population. So what all of this is about is saying, does that SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, correlate with the traits that interest us? Now the problem is, there are tens of millions of these SNPs. So for 10 years, people were just taking ones they thought might be important, and that didn't pan out at all. What changed everything was the technological revolution that allowed for what we call genome-wide association. So the technological advance was a SNP chip the size of a postage stamp that can genotype hundreds of thousands of SNPs spread throughout the genome. And it's an atheoretical approach that asks, are there any SNPs that are related to a trait, like school achievement or weight or schizophrenia? And that red line there is a line of genome-wide significance, and above that red line are statistically significant hits. And the point is, like on chromosome 1, these are arranged by the 23 chromosomes, by the way. So below the red line are hundreds of thousands, millions actually, of SNPs that don't make it. They aren't at all associated. But the height of the line, it's called a Manhattan plot because those are the ones that are most highly associated with the trait of interest. So this really worked. It replicated in other studies, and it was named the invention of the year, the breakthrough of the year. Thousands of robust associations throughout the life sciences, medicine, as well as psychology. But then, after the celebrations died down, people realized there's something very weird here, and that is there are no big effects. We can categorically say that common disorders and quantitative traits like school achievement, although they're highly heritable, there are no major gene effects. It's not just like finding a handful of genes. What this research suggests, it proves, is that there are many, many genes of very small effect. The biggest effect sizes, do you see 1%, are so much smaller than anyone thought would be the case. So what do you do with that? Because that means there must be thousands, tens of thousands of tiny DNA differences that account for heritability. So in the last 3 years, the excitement has been in realizing that just like a scale on a questionnaire, you can add up the items in what we call a multiple genic score, and then use that single number as a risk indicator, say for schizophrenia, alcoholism, cardiovascular disease, or cognitive abilities and school achievement. And so this is adding up those scores, And there are hundreds of these available for psychological traits. Most of the research has gone into the major psychoses of schizophrenia, bipolar manic depression, and major depressive disorder. They've had some success. They haven't been stunningly successful for reasons I could go into. But the star has been cognitive abilities, and the superstar right now is my area of research, which is school achievement. We can today, with DNA alone, predict 15% of the variance of the differences between children on the UK national curriculum test called GCSE, which everyone takes at the end of compulsory schooling. Now, it's only 15%, it's 60% heritable, but this is just in the last year. And I safely predict that in 2 years' time, it'll at least be double that. So these are pretty good predictions, and they've come very quickly. But just, we talked this morning about, say, girls and boys and verbal ability in math. Boys are good at math, girls are good at verbal. That explains less than 1% of the differences. So if all you know about a kid is that they're a boy or a girl, you don't know anything about their math ability or verbal ability. Another contrast, in the UK, we assess all our schools through these Ofsted ratings. And how much does the quality of school explain in GCSE results? It's less than that. Income of parents is predictive of schools' performance. It explains less than that. So this is not everything, but this is a pretty strong prediction, and it's getting stronger by the month. So here are the results we're just about to publish, showing what I just described. And this presents the results by taking our 10,000 kids with their GCSE scores and polygenic scores and dividing them into deciles. So on the left, you have the lowest 10%, and on the right, you have the highest 10%. And is a box plot, so the boxes in the middle are 50% of each of those groups. So you can see there's a difference, a linear relationship between polygenic scores, but at the extremes, the differences are quite extreme. The lowest group have an average GCSE score of C, and the highest group have an average score of A-. There's a wide range, though, because we're only explaining 15% of the variance. So can you see on the left, I don't know if you can see that faint yellow line, but at the bottom of that yellow line on the left, at the top, there are some kids with the lowest polygenic scores with higher GCSE grades than those with the highest polygenic score. Conversely, some of the kids with the highest polygenic scores have GCSE scores lower than those with the lowest polygenic scores. So it's a strong prediction, but it's by no means a perfect prediction because we never have perfect predictions. The only way to get that is with a correlation of 1, and we don't see correlations much stronger than this in the behavioral sciences. And it has real-world significance. The bottom group, 25% go to university, and the top group, 75% go to university. What's important about polygenic scores, unlike other predictors, like infant tests don't predict cognitive ability later at all. We have very little in infancy that predicts psychopathology, for example. But DNA can predict from birth just as well as it can from later in life, for the reason I mentioned, that DNA does not change throughout life. It's the same DNA. And it's also important because it means that you can predict from DNA without knowing anything else about what goes on between genes and behavior, because you're correlating the DNA differences with outcomes. So you don't have to know about the mechanisms that lie in between gene expression before anyone asks epigenetics, brain stuff, environments. Nothing changes your DNA sequence. So that's why I say there's no backward causation. So that's a quick overview of what the book talks about, but the last 2 chapters of each section talk about implications. And I'll touch on those briefly. If you're interested in these, we can talk about it. I'm trying to leave 10 or 15 minutes for discussion. These 3 findings that we talked about have some obvious implications. The one that has gotten the most attention, like in New Scientist last month, is a section I maybe foolhardily called Parents Matter, but they don't make a difference. Can you see what I mean? Parents matter a lot. They provide the physical and psychological support for kids to develop. But they don't make a difference in that differences in parenting do not actually relate environmentally to differences in outcome. There aren't those systematic family environmental effects. We're talking again about the normal range of variation. And so what I think the implication of this is for parents is to relax, to realize they don't have as much control as they think. And that's pretty damn good if you have a kid who's, say, schizophrenic, because you don't find out about that till they're 18. And it's kind of nice not to believe the psychoanalysts anymore who say that's because of what you did early in life. I mean, how much more wicked can you get than that? And I think of parenting as a relationship. You do things for your kid because you love them, not because you're trying to mold them like a piece of clay to be what you want them to be. And I think it's a liberating message for parents, because if there are young parents here, you know you're bombarded with parent-rearing books and newspaper articles implying that if you take one false step, your child's going to be ruined forever. So I hope it is liberating for parents. Here's another section that got some attention when I go to educational places, but it's the same thing. Schools matter. That's why we have universal education. We have to inculcate basic skills of reading, literacy, and numeracy, and culture. But the differences in schools don't make a difference once you control for genetics. The book talks a lot about that. The environmental effects aren't those systematic effects shared by kids in the same family. So kids go to the same schools. They're not similar because of going to the same schools. And what looks like systematic effects of schools is genetically mediated. This is the nature of nurture issue. This is where I get in the biggest trouble here in England, where there are all these private schools. There's a big difference in school achievement of kids in private schools or state schools. But that difference is a self-fulfilling prophecy of selection. They select for heritable traits, and those kids end up doing well. If you correct for what the selective schools select on, there's no difference in the educational outcomes of those children. So that paying several £100,000 isn't adding value to your kid's educational achievement. Now, you might be doing it for other reasons, like you want them to hang out with the right sort of people. There's also evidence that it provides access later in life for jobs, but it's not improving their educational achievement. And it leads me to think about education in a different way. Instead of having this national curriculum that you're trying to shove in kids' heads and have them parrot it back, what this suggests is that kids are selecting and modifying and creating their educational environments on the basis of their genetic propensities. So it suggests a different model where we move away from this passive model to a more active model in which give kids opportunities to find the environments they want, and that we teach kids to learn and to enjoy learning, which seems so obvious, doesn't it? But it's not. We're teaching kids to take tests, to stress out about it. Must be putting them off to learning. And it's so important, as you guys will know, that it's said that more than half of the jobs of the future we don't even know about now. So what's the point of training our kids for very specific skills? We need to have them learn how to find out by themselves and to evaluate information, say, in this era of fake news. Okay, so those are some of the implications of genetics. And on genomics, I won't really have time to talk about the implications, but I think they're already transforming science. All the life sciences now are using these polygenic scores. It's changing clinical work. It's moving away from diagnoses to dimensions. And it's changing society in that 16 million people have paid to have their genotypes done through direct-to-consumer companies, for example. So there are a lot of implications, a lot of pros and cons. But I wanted to end by talking about the paperback, which just came out, which has a new section, an afterword, which talks about the reactions since the book came out. Because USI is very good at saying we need to be concerned about the negative aspects, the things to worry about, as well as the things to be excited about. Now, I will say I'm definitely a cheerleader. I'm an advocate for this. I see a lot of good that can come out of it. In medicine, for example, we're moving from models of curing diseases to predicting and preventing them. It's got to be the way to go. And DNA is the best predictor around because you can predict from early in life. Same thing's going to be true for psychological disorders. But there are problems, and maybe these are things that you've been thinking about as I've been talking. Discrimination, labeling. I can just have time to give you a short little bumper sticker. Kids are already labeled. They know their test scores. They know who the bluebirds and the robins are. Eugenics, people don't bring this up, only the media does. I think it's a lazy trope of the media. Are we going to revert to some sort of Nazi eugenics program of breeding? You know, I can't, well, all I can say is totalitarian regimes are bad. They're bad in themselves. The scientific fig leaf they use, whether it's genetics for Nazis or, more often, environmental fig leaves like Stalin, Mao, and North Korea. They believe there are no differences, so you treat everybody the same. It's an environmental model. Well, totalitarian regimes are bad for people, and it's the fig leaf they use isn't so important. But you know, there are issues involved here. Many of you have probably seen the film Gattaca. We could talk about that. The most common concern I get is determinism and fatalism. You know, if you know things are genetic, doesn't that mean you're just going to give up? Well, we have a grandson who had trouble learning to read. You just say, oh, well, he's thick, give up. No, you know you've got to put in more energy. If you can predict who's going to have the problems, maybe you can prevent those problems from happening. Doesn't mean it's determined or innate or unmodifiable. It just means other things being equal, he's going to have a harder time learning to read. With me, my highest polygenic score, and in the book, I provide the world's first polygenic score profile, and that's for me. The highest score is for body mass index weight. And I'm at the 94th percentile for the genetic polygenic risk indicator for weight. Well, I'm at the 70th percentile of actual weight. You know, borderline obese, though, according to these BMI people. But does that mean then I say, okay, give up, I can't do anything about it? I find with this and with many of the other issues that arise, it's actually positive, it's motivating. For me, it means this isn't just the 6 pounds I put on at Christmas. This is a lifelong battle of the bulge. And it helps me to realize that I have to control my environment. I can't have junk food in the house. It just keeps me awake at night. So I think there's a lot of examples in which these low-tech interventions can help us deal with genetics. Another complaint is I don't talk about group differences. I'm talking about individual differences, why people in this room differ. I'm not saying what's the cause of average differences between males and females, or between classes, or between ethnic groups. And there's 3 reasons for that. One is most of the variance is within groups rather than between groups. So, as I said, girls good at verbal, boys good at math, explains less than 1% of the variance. The second reason is we don't have good tools to get at the causes of average differences between groups. And that's why there's so much heat and so little light, I think. And the third reason I've come more and more to feel is I can say I don't have to study everything, and I think that's like the third rail, politically explosive. There are more important issues that are more tractable. And limited predictive power, I've already talked about that. Some people say you're only explaining 15% of the variance, but then I point out, well, what do you think the correlation between blood alcohol levels and drunk driving accidents are? Extremely low. But it doesn't stop us, rightly, from saying, you take this license, you get banged up if you drive drunk, because you have an increased chance of having an accident. And then finally, mechanisms. People say, but you don't know the mechanisms. Well, that's what I explained, that we're looking at the relationship between DNA differences and outcomes without knowing anything about what goes on in between. We'd love to know what goes on in between, but good luck to the molecular biologists if there are thousands of tiny DNA differences that account for genetic influence. So that's all described in a lot more detail. I did want to mention there are 60 pages of notes in very tiny print. The book was twice as long when I submitted it to Penguin, and I had this wonderful editor who said, cut it down, make it simpler. Some stuff was too painful to just completely delete. So I put details and all the references for this stuff in the notes. And the book ends with a short epilogue in which I explain why I wrote the book, and that is to give people the DNA literacy they need for us to have an important conversation about the DNA revolution, because it's going to affect all of us. And I hope you can think about in your business and in your personal life, yourselves and your children. I hope this gives you some ideas as an unexpected source of inspiration. Thank you.